whether these microplastics are actually damaging the inside of our arteries, which is a reasonable hypothesis. There's some apparent link between microplastic exposure and cardiovascular disease. So I do think it's worth minimizing our exposure to plastics. And the statistics are crazy. I mean, I've heard different things, but people say like, oh, you're eating 5 grams of microplastics a month, which is the equivalent of a credit card, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
All right, you guys, I just got done recording with Paul Saladino, and I am just floored, and you're going to be too with this interview. If you've ever questioned what carnivore is versus animal-based, they're completely different, and Paul shares why he personally made the switch from carnivore to animal-based and why he even went carnivore in the first place, because he was having issues himself. So this is just one topic that we cover, but if you see in today's show notes, I mean, we go all the way into if you can't digest meat, if even Paul eats chicken or yogurt or anything out of a can. We go into intermittent fasting, grounding. We go into how to prepare grains, tomatoes, potatoes, how to prepare them in the right way so that you don't have digestive upsets. We talk about plastics. Even dust in our home contain plastics that we're breathing in, which is really insane. That's something new that I learned today. We also go into a protein allergy. Do you have it? How to determine if you do have a protein allergy, what to look for, and maybe ways to mitigate that. And so, I mean, I can't even tell you, this intro is going to be just as long as the interview. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And you guys already know this, but I'm your host, Bethany Cameron, and you're listening to the Digest This podcast. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining me today. We're so excited because it's not just me, but my followers are so excited to hear from you and hear all that you have to say.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So first of all, I like to start off my podcast with rapid fire yes or no questions. So I have just a few questions here, but you can only answer yes or no.
Okay.
Are you ready?
All right.
Okay. So here we go. Again, first question from the following here. Are you single?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry, ladies. He's taken. That was so funny because that was a very popular one. Do you eat chicken or turkey?
Yes.
Do you intermittent fast?
No.
Do you eat yogurt?
Yes.
Do you ever eat out of a can?
No.
Do you ever go out to eat on occasion?
Yes.
Okay, and last question. Would you ever want to have kids? And then this is again from a follower. We need a generation like you.
Yes, I would like to have kids.
All right. Awesome. Now this is a one more question, and this is a multiple choice question.
Okay.
If you could only have one type of animal protein, which one would it be? A, liver, B, ground beef, C, eggs, or D, fish?
Ground beef.
All right. I had a feeling it was going to be ground beef. Quick tip here. If you're trying to get in more animal protein, specifically red meat, but you cannot digest red meat or you just are having trouble, I've definitely experienced that myself, and it was really, really hard for me to get in enough red meat protein. So I actually started incorporating Equip Foods Prime Protein. It's their unflavored beef protein powder. And I know what you're thinking. It's like, wait, what the heck is beef protein powder? Well, it's different than bone broth powder. And it basically is like the same equivalent to a 4-ounce piece of grass-fed steak. It has 20 grams of protein, and the ingredients, it's just one, the unflavored one ingredient. And that's what I stick to. I add it to my smoothies. You can even add it to like your mac and cheese sauce, hot drinks. I have even added it to my coffee instead of the gelatin that I was previously using. And it froths your coffee like no other. And you're getting in tons of protein. So whether it's a smoothie, your coffee, or a guacamole dip, and you want to get in red meat and you want to digest it, definitely check out Prime Protein. And it's from the company Equip Foods. Again, I always get the unflavored because there's no sugar alternatives, no natural flavors. And I just think it's so versatile, and it's something everyone should incorporate in their diet. Another important thing is that it is grass-fed and it's tested for heavy metals, toxins, things like glyphosate. So they go the extra mile to make sure they're providing you with the cleanest source. It is definitely keto and paleo as well as carnivore. So if you're following any of those diets, or again, you just want to get more red meat into your personal diet plan, check out Equip Foods Prime Unflavored Protein. And if you go to equipfoods.com/digest and use code DIGEST, you'll get 20% off. That's 20% off Equip Foods Prime Protein. Just go to equipfoods.com/digest and use code DIGEST. I was able to try Peak Tea's new coffee alternative a month before it actually launched, and I've been obsessed ever since. It's called Nandaka, and it reminds me of an upscale hot cocoa when enjoyed warm, but you can also add it to a smoothie for a creamy coffee alternative drink. It's designed to help hormone regulation, and who doesn't need a little hormone regulating these days? Am I right? This blend is infused with ceremonial Peruvian cacao to activate metabolism, functional mushrooms to enhance mood and promote cellular renewal, and fermented pu'er teas that provide calm, sustained energy. And if it's from Peak, then you already can trust it's organic, vegan, and non-GMO. And the best part is that there's no added sugar, preservatives, fillers, or quote, natural flavors that are commonly being added to teas and drink mixes these days, which is quite disturbing, honestly. So I know I can trust Peak Tea because they don't add any nasties or questionable ingredients. Plus, they triple toxin screen all their teas for purity, ensuring no mold, pesticides, heavy metals, or harmful chemicals are in their tea crystals. And yes, even though they're all certified organic, Peak Tea still takes the extra step to screen all their powders. So whether you drink coffee or not, I really think you'll be obsessed, just like I am, with their Nandaka coffee alternative. It's perfect hot or chilled. And this is really cool because they have a free 30-day return policy. So if you try something and you're not happy with it, just send it back for a refund. And you guys know I got a deal for you as well. So if you go to peaklife.com/digest, you can receive up to 15% off plus up to 2 free gifts. That's peaklife.com/digest to get a discount and some freebies. That's peaklife.com/digest. So a lot of people, I'm sure, are aware of you, what you're about. But in case people listening do not know who you are, first of all, you are very animal-based. And first of all, tell us what made you make the change in your diet and your lifestyle, because obviously you didn't always eat this way, right? Like, what's your story?
Yeah, I've thought about food for most of my life. I mean, even when I was a young kid, I thought about food. My dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. And I think I was just curious as a child, trying to understand what food made us healthy and what food made us unhealthy. I've gone through all sorts of different phases. I had a cereal phase when I was a kid. I ate tons and tons of cereal and skim milk. I grew up in a household that feared fat. because my dad was an internist in the 1980s. I had a vegan phase in I would say my early 30s. I was a raw vegan for about 7 months. I've had paleo phases after that, where I was kind of paleo, which is, I don't know, meat, vegetables, fruit, nuts, seeds, for probably 6 or 8 years. Then I had a carnivore phase. So that transition between paleo and carnivore is kind of interesting. I did a vegan diet right when I started out in medicine. So before I was a doctor, I was a physician assistant. I worked in cardiology. I hadn't really been taught much about nutrition or biochemistry, and certainly nothing about nutritional biochemistry in school. And the first things I came across in nutrition led me to believe that animal products were harmful to humans, how differently we feel about that now, and that cooking food was harmful for humans. So interesting, right? And I did a raw vegan diet. I lost probably 10 to 15 or even 20 pounds of lean muscle mass. So I got very, very skinny. And I ended up stopping the vegan diet for a number of reasons. I had really, really bad GI symptoms. I had horrible gas. And I actually had a woman tell me she didn't want to date me or even go on a date with me because I was too skinny. And I thought, there's my evolutionary cue. If I can't pass on my genetics because I don't look fit enough to defend a family, something is wrong with this vegan diet. Obviously, I think there are other concerns that I have with vegan diets, nutrient deficiencies long-term, et cetera. So then I did paleo, gained some weight back. And when I was in medical school and then residency at the University of Washington in Seattle, I had some pretty bad eczema flares. I struggled with eczema and asthma, kind of this atopic triad of autoimmunity that I had my whole life. I had a lot of inhalers forced on me as a child. My parents forced me to take a medicine called theophylline, which was given to kids in the 1980s in applesauce for my asthma. And theophylline is kind of like caffeine. It just makes you really hyper and makes you feel horrible. So I was over-medicated as a child. My parents are amazing. I love them. They were well-intentioned, but the execution was poor, in my opinion. So I struggled with these atopic challenges of eczema, asthma, allergies for my whole life. And it just came to a head when I was in residency in Washington. I thought, this is crazy. I had a really bad eczema flare after experimenting with some mushroom extracts, chaga reishi, things that are popular today. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to go super simple. I heard about the carnivore diet and I ended up just eating meat for 1.5 years, meat, organs, fat, and salt. Positives were that the eczema got completely better. Negatives were that long-term ketosis and carbohydrate limitation had some pretty significant side effects for me, as it does for a lot of people: electrolyte insufficiency, muscle cramps, heart palpitations, heart fluttering, declining sex hormones. So my testosterone is usually around 800 total. It went down to 500, sleep disturbance, always feeling a little cold. So then that was when I was really interested in this carnivore diet. And I got kind of fascinated by the notion, which I still believe, that there are some foods, many foods that we consider to be healthy today, whether it's grains. Whole grains are a huge part of the food pyramid, leafy greens, or some vegetables that appear to be triggering to some people at their immune level, which is fascinating because I think very few people are talking about this. And a lot of my ideas tend to get painted in terms of black and white. And over time, I've really evolved, and I think I'm much more soft on the ideas now. But I've continued to believe that there are a lot of these foods that seem to be triggering my eczema. And I've seen that now that I've tried to reintroduce them and the eczema comes back, or could be triggering autoimmune issues for other people that are never really talked about. We're sort of given this black and white perspective. These foods are healthy. These foods are not healthy. Most people understand that like plants and animal foods, generally healthy, and processed foods unhealthy. But I think even within the plant kingdom, it's interesting to point out that if people continue to struggle as I did, some of those plant foods can trigger people. Not everybody, but some people. So at that point, I was carnivore. Improvements in autoimmunity, not so great physiologically in terms of electrolytes, hormones, sleep, et cetera. Added carbohydrates back, first as fruit, then honey, now raw dairy, with some other experiments. That's kind of where I've ended up now. It's interesting to think about these things because when you end up in a position where you're talking about the benefits of red meat and the saturated fat that comes with it and the potential issues for some people with vegetables, you basically piss everyone off in the whole world. Whether it's people who are worried about ApoB and cholesterol, or people who are champions for fiber, or plant-based folks. And that's great because it ends up in hopefully respectful discussion and people can kind of learn. But I think it's kind of hard to cut through the noise today. And I imagine most people thinking about diet are just massively confused today.
Yeah, well, and I love that you are a little bit more open now as opposed to so many other people
on the internet or whatever, pushing some like agenda. And I do have a question. So what are 4 things that you have changed your mind on that you once were just black and white, yes or no?
Yeah. So the first is probably fructose and sugar in general. By sugar, I think we think of something called sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. And in a state of humility, I'll say that when I wrote my first book, The Carnivore Code, I penned multiple paragraphs and pages about the dangers of fructose. And so that's really humbling to think about the research a little more holistically or in its entirety now and understand why I was so mistaken. So if you look at the research on fructose, it's pretty clear that the reason that we think it's bad for humans is based on rat studies or mice studies. And those animals don't metabolize fructose the same way that Homo sapiens do. They do much higher rates of something called de novo lipogenesis, where they immediately turn fructose into fat. Humans do that with fructose, but to a very, very small degree, less than 1% probably. Rats and mice do it to a much higher degree. A lot of other studies with fructose either feed humans or rats and mice isolated fructose, and that doesn't occur in nature. Fructose always occurs with glucose. What we find is if you feed basically any mammal fructose in isolation, it doesn't get absorbed well because it needs glucose to get absorbed in the intestine. And malabsorbed fructose leads to overgrowth of bacteria in the gut. And that we know is a bad thing. That's often termed dysbiosis. And certainly it can lead to increases in this compound called lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin, which is a portion of the gram-negative bacterial cell wall. And that's a very inflammatory thing in humans. I think most people would agree to that. So LPS, aka endotoxin, really bad for humans. And conditions that lead to quote unquote gut inflammation, the problems with the gut inflammation are increases in endotoxin transit from the gut into the body. So fructose, I've changed my mind on significantly. That's almost a complete 180. I now believe that there's plenty of benefits to fruit, even fruit juice I don't fear in humans. Things like honey, lots of interesting studies on honey being healthy for humans. I think there's a point at which you wouldn't want to overconsume these things, and that's pretty individual. Just like anything, you could overconsume water. But I think most people now are fearing these foods, and I don't think there's a real reason to. There's a lot of really great studies with fruit juice. Specifically, that's the one that always gets vilified. And of course, there's qualities of fruit juice, whether it's a reconstituted from concentrate, pasteurized, Minute Maid in the grocery store versus a fresh squeezed orange juice, probably completely different things at a biochemical level. But there's tons of studies on orange juice, watermelon juice, cherry juice, pomegranate juice. The list is really long. And they do all sorts of interesting things, whether it's decreasing the sort of the predilection of LDL to become oxidized. So decreasing LDL or lipoprotein oxidation, making your cholesterol more stable, like at a high level, improving endothelial function in blood vessels, decreasing oxidative stress markers, all kinds of positive things with fruit juice, something that gets vilified all the time. So that's number 1 is fruit and fructose. Number 2 is keto and carbohydrates in general. I think that though ketogenic diets are probably indicated for some people or very low carb for some people, I don't think there's as much conversation in the low carb community as I wish there were about potential downsides to that. Looking at thyroid declining or sex hormones or women having menstrual irregularities from limiting carbohydrates too much. And carbohydrates are an interesting thing in our society. They're kind of a lightning rod, or at least our nutritional society. I think there are much easier sources of carbohydrates for humans to tolerate and some sources of carbohydrates that cause a lot of problems for people, whether it's the gluten intolerance with wheat for a lot of people, or grains, I think can be very problematic for a lot of people unless they're really intentionally detoxified, quote unquote. So I think that there are a lot of concerning things about limiting carbohydrates, especially for women who are looking to be fertile or conceive or maintain pregnancies in the postpartum. And a lot of that, I think, comes from carbohydrate fearing and sugar fearing. And there's a lot of negative sides to it that is never really talked about, whether it's decreased exercise recovery, declining sex hormones, increased advanced glycation end products in studies with ketogenic or low carb diets. Now, that's a whole separate conversation about how to introduce and where everyone is in terms of how many carbohydrates they might eat for optimal life. The third thing is fasting and intermittent fasting. And it's kind of the same thing. When I look at those interventions, I think they're well-intentioned, but I think that they're easily overused. It's such a potent medication, quote unquote. It's such a potent intervention to stop eating food that it's easily overused, and quickly your body, I think, quickly it becomes net negative at the level of stress hormones, cortisol, glucagon, catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine. So I think fasting can quickly shift from a positive thing to a negative thing, even intermittent fasting for people. But there are applications to all of these things. And then the fourth one, I would probably say, trying to think of the fourth one. Fourth one is probably that I've been thinking about a lot recently is like grounding. I used to kind of poo-poo grounding and think like, oh, that's nothing interesting. But there's some interesting stuff on grounding. And there's a lot of interesting studies suggesting that the immune system looks different when we're grounded. And it's not that we can be grounded all the time, just that we should think about our environment in a different way. And we look at our pets and they're almost always grounded because they're just walking around barefoot all the time. And humans would have been touching the earth. It's often considered woo-woo, but there's a lot of cool things about actually thinking about grounding and our environment.
Yeah. Gee, I mean, I feel like, first of all, props to you for really kind of going back and you're not afraid to admit that maybe things that you once thought are different now. And I think a lot of people don't ever want to do that about themselves. So I just applaud you for really, openly admitting to that. And it's always great. I think our bodies are always changing. There's new studies coming out all the time. So it's never great to just be closed-minded and never be open to changing.
It's kind of a fun place to be open-minded. Yeah, I think that in the health space, like I said earlier, I would imagine that people that are trying to get healthy, it's a little dizzying because there's so many conflicting pieces of information today. And so it's probably hard if they think someone is valuable and then they change their mind on something. But I think most people understand that this is just shifting. And I think that I still believe most of the same things that I've always believed. It's just a few nuances that I've shifted on.
Right. Well, and too, like just for example, like the whole carb topic thing, like carbs are just so broad in general. There's different types of carbohydrates, like fruit carbs versus starchy carbs versus just packaged garbage carbs, so you really have to get into the nitty gritty to explain the why behind that. Now, you follow now a more animal-based diet. Can you explain to the listeners the difference between a carnivore diet versus an animal-based diet?
Yeah, so carnivore, I think, technically is just animal foods. Meat, eggs, fish, chicken, turkey, cheese, dairy, some people would include on their carnivore diet, just animal products. And like I said, that works great for some things, and long-term for me, it didn't work without more carbohydrates. I thought about this term animal-based a number of years ago. It was actually when I was on Rogan's podcast. He sort of came up with the term animal-based, and I've stuck with it. I want it to stand in contradistinction to plant-based, right? So you can be plant-based and get the majority of your diet from plants, or you can be animal-based and get the majority of your diet or calories or nutrients from animals. So the idea of an animal-based diet is just broadly speaking, like, okay, I'm going to eat meat, but I'm also going to eat plants. It's essentially synonymous with an omnivore diet, but just so people can understand what we're talking about, on an animal-based diet, I sort of said, okay, well, let's just say you're going to get your protein and a lot of your vitamins and minerals from meat and organs, and then you're going to get carbohydrates, at least to start, from fruit and honey and raw dairy. I think those are the most easily digestible sources of carbohydrates for most people, not everyone. And that's kind of the foundation of an animal-based diet. So it's meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy. And again, I think of this as like, this is kind of the foods that humans have always sought out preferentially historically. I think anthropology is fascinating, and I wish I'd been taught anthropology in medical school. I went to Africa to visit the Hadza, and I've read a lot of books out of curiosity about hunter-gatherers. And if you go to visit these people, they really treasure sweet things, and they treasure meat and animal foods. And then they will eat, quote, vegetables sometimes, especially roots, but those are fallback foods. I mean, there's an article published by John Marlowe, who's a scholar who's worked with the Hadza for decades. And the title of the article is Tubers as a Fallback Food for the Hadza. He sort of ranked their favorite foods, and they had 5 favorite foods, which were meat, honey, berries, baobab, which is a fruit that grows in Africa. Uniquely, it's actually called the tree of life. It's this really incredible looking tree with this huge trunk and these branches that come out. The baobab is a really cool looking tree. And then the 5th one is tubers. And both men and women rank tubers as their least favorite food. Men and women both say honey is their favorite food among the Hadza. Men say meat is their second food, meat and organs. Women have like a three-way tie between berries, meat, and baobab for 2, 3, and 4. So if we think about just what foods humans have always craved at the top of the hierarchy, for us, it's the reason that junk food manufacturers and processed food manufacturers make things that are sweet, because we have this evolutionary appreciation for fruit and honey, because those were foods that were very nourishing for us and really a signal of abundance. And so what do we do today? Well, we make a Snickers bar with a processed high fructose corn syrup and fillers and stabilizers and carrageenan and artificial flavors and all kinds of things. And that's essentially triggering an evolutionary instinct to eat fruit. So it's no wonder that children are saying, like, give me candy. It's not that, that the children are bad or that they're making bad judgment. It's that we're still running this program from 350,000 years of Homo sapien existence, but we're running this program in a very different landscape than we've ever been exposed to. I mean, think about the proliferation of different foods that we've never seen as humans over the last 100 years. And so we're suddenly in this landscape and we don't even know how to choose, because so many of the foods are kind of meant to confuse us. They're in some ways playing on this instinct of us to seek fat, because that's part of our evolution. We need fat to survive, and we need carbohydrates, I think I would argue, to survive. And we would have gotten fat from animals at certain times of the year when they were sort of the most fat. That's when animals are the most sought after by humans. And we would have gotten fruit when it was in season, depending how close we are to the equator. We would have gotten honey every instinct, every opportunity we would have consumed the honey. In the last maybe 20,000 years, we've figured out that we can domesticate animals, which allows us to do milk and dairy, which can be a nutritious food. I would argue for humans throughout the lifespan. That's controversial. But you think about those foods, and those are sort of the foundational foods on an animal-based diet. When I talk to people about an animal-based diet, I also say that the goal is always to have the most varied, interesting, fun, delicious diet possible. And some people can add more foods on top of that, depending on what they tolerate.
Okay.
So whether it's going to be tubers or, if you want to do some fermented grains or sourdough bread, but the idea is kind of like, if you start here with meat, organs, fruit, honey, raw dairy, I think that's a good place to start for people. That allows simplicity, intentionality, signal to noise differentiation, but then also gives you enough of carbohydrates, but also nutrients, so that you don't run into the extreme sort of limitations you do on a carnivore diet.
I wash my hands at least 100 times a day. I am not exaggerating, you guys. And when I recipe test, I can easily wash my hand 50 times in just 1 hour, because I'm constantly touching my phone to film, then touching the food, then going back and forth. And I'm always trying to keep my hands clean from the food when I touch my phone, and keep my food clean and sterile. Maybe you aren't as OCD as me. I don't know, maybe you are. No judgment here. But regardless, most of us do wash our hands a lot each day, and that's a lot of exposure to chemicals all day long if you are not using a non-toxic hand soap, which has been known to disrupt your hormones and even cause certain types of cancer. So what are the ingredients to avoid in hand soap? Well, fragrances, which frequently contain phthalates, which won't be listed on the label, by the way. That's associated with hormone disruption, birth defects, and developmental toxicity. Even natural fragrances aren't safe to use because they can trigger allergies and can also contain phthalates. Parabens are another ingredient to avoid. These mimic the behavior of estrogen in the body and are also associated with endocrine disruption, cancer, and developmental toxicity. Sodium lauryl sulfate, that's another one to watch out for. This poses health concerns associated with organ system toxicity and irritation of the skin, eyes, and lungs. Even more concerning is the contaminant that can form as a byproduct of the manufacturing process called 1,4-dioxane. This nasty chemical is a known carcinogen. There are plenty of other substances we should avoid, commonly found in hand soaps, that I won't even go into for time's sake, but I do want to assure you that Branch Basics does not contain any of those harmful ingredients. And they just came out with a hand soap free from fragrances, dyes, parabens, alcohol, sodium lauryl sulfate, and is completely non-toxic and safe for even your kids and pets. Branch Basics new gel hand soap comes in a glass bottle, is made with only the safest ingredients that promote your health and nourish your skin. It's plant and mineral based and biodegradable. And with their sustainable glass pump, you only buy the container once and then you can just buy the refill bags, which I love. So if you want to clean up your home and your health by using Branch Basics, they're offering my listeners 15% off. Just use code LITTLESIPPER at checkout to receive a discount. Again, just go to BRANCHBASICS.com and enter code LITTLESIPPER. That's branchbasics.com and use code LILSIPPER at checkout to receive a discount. All right, you may not know this about me, but every morning before I drink my daily coffee, I actually drink electrolytes first. There's 2 reasons I do this. 1, your body is naturally dehydrated from the previous night's sleep and is craving hydration. And 2, coffee actually dehydrates you, even though it is technically a liquid. So, rule of thumb, hydrate before you caffeinate. I personally use Element electrolytes in my morning routine. It's literally the first thing I drink every single morning. I stick to their raw, unflavored version, which contains no sugar, no flavorings, no coloring, and no fillers. It contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of salt, magnesium, and potassium. And their unflavored version has only those 3 ingredients. Element is by far the cleanest electrolyte drink I've found on the market, and I've been looking for a while. Other electrolyte drink mixes have added sugar, maltodextrin, dextrose, gums, and even added oils. Electrolytes are essential for our body to function. So you want to not only make sure you are getting them in your body, but you are getting the best kind. There's also research to back that when you keep hydrated, there are lower risks of anxiety and depression in individuals. So whether you just finished a workout, sauna session, or just waking up in the morning, Element is formulated to help anyone with their electrolyte needs and is perfectly suited for those following a keto, low-carb, vegan, or paleo diet. Right now, Element is offering my listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single serving packs free with any Element order. To get 8 free packs, you must go to DRINKLMNT.com/digest to get this offer. Element also has a no questions asked refund policy, so you can try it totally risk-free. If you don't like it, they will give you your money back, no questions asked. You have nothing to lose. So go to DRINKLMNT.com/digest to get this amazing offer. I'll also leave that link in today's show notes so you can easily scroll down and order with just one easy tap.
Okay, interesting. So many questions here. Do you ever eat sourdough? Like if it's legit sourdough, homemade, someone you trust?
I don't, because I can't get it here. And I've been thinking about experimenting with it, but I haven't been able to get it. So I live in Costa Rica most of the time. And what I've learned, and this is probably true anywhere, is that if I'm going to eat a food, I really want to prepare it myself. I don't always trust how other foods are prepared. I'll give you an example. So for instance, there are certain cheeses that I eat in Costa Rica and I just don't feel great. And I think like, okay, what kind of salt is the person using to make this cheese? And it's a fresh cheese. It's like a young goat. It's like a raw cheese, but it's just something about it is weird. Like I didn't make the cheese. I don't know what kind of salt went into it. I don't know what kind of water, it's just like there's something in there that doesn't quite make me feel great. And I'm a particularly sensitive human. And so when I've done experiments, because I've been kind of dabbling with starches recently in my own diet, I'll do things like white rice, and I'm not as apt to like go to a restaurant and order white rice. I'm going to buy organic white rice. I'm going to rinse it, and then I'm going to ferment it for 2 days in warm water with lemon and apple cider vinegar. And then I'm going to pressure cook it because I want to know, like, if I prepare it, how does it make me feel? For me, the rice still doesn't make me feel great when I do that, which is like, okay, that's crazy. So if I could get like a really good organic wheat that I knew didn't have glyphosate and other pesticides on it, maybe something like an einkorn or like a, one of these ancestral wheats, and I could get a sourdough starter and I could ferment it myself, then I would bake bread and I would try it and see how I felt. That's what it's all about, I think, for people. Like, if you can get your diet, and this is a lot of work, but if you have issues and you can get your diet to a point that it's pretty consistent and you introduce one thing, then you can kind of tell how that thing makes you feel. I think a lot of us struggle because our diets are so complicated and we don't know, like, do I have a headache because it's something I ate? Or is it because I was driving behind that diesel truck, or because I'm stressed, or because I didn't sleep? So I think it's valuable for humans to, if they're struggling with things, to try and simplify the diet, create a good baseline, and then just do one little thing at a time, whether it's introducing white potatoes or tomatoes or white rice or kale or spinach or whatever you want to eat, or, sourdough bread, and then seeing how it makes you feel. It gives you it's really incredible what you find. I mean, I'll just tell you this, so I really like tomatoes. I'm Italian. My last name is Saladino. And for the longest time, I thought, okay, tomatoes, it's a nightshade, can't do it. But I was like, you know what, let me try. So I get organic tomatoes at the farmer's market here in Costa Rica. I know the farmer, they assure me they're organic. I boil them, I take the skins off, I cut them open, I take the seeds out. It's just like a, I don't know. It's like a hobby for me. I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend 45 minutes this morning making tomato paste because this is an experiment. I want to understand it. So I get 12 or 13 tomatoes. I make my own tomato paste, like homemade tomato paste, and I put it on my burgers, and it's delicious. And within 2 days, I get pretty significant eczema on my wrists. And I think, okay, like, that's the only thing I changed. My body doesn't really like the tomatoes. And I might repeat that twice. And then after 2 times, I think, you know what? I actually can't eat tomatoes. Like, we're not crazy to think that tomatoes actually trigger immune issues for some people, because it does happen. Not for everybody, but for some people like me, I think, oh man, and I don't like getting the eczema. It's itchy, and it kind of like, it can get weepy and get infected. And I always think like, okay, my immune system is activated. I don't want chronic low-level inflammation in my body. So that was my experiment with tomatoes, and it didn't work for me. And but that's a really valuable thing to be able to do, to say, I did one thing. I'm 98% sure it was the tomatoes. They just don't work for me. And whether the symptom is a headache, poor sleep, like GI issues, burping I've gotten with some foods. Like when I tried to reincorporate jalapenos, I was in Los Angeles and I saw jalapenos, like organic fermented jalapenos at Erewhon. I thought, let's try it. Like, that would be great on a burger. It goes down great. It tastes good. And I burp jalapenos for the next 8 hours. And I think, okay, that's just not for me. I don't usually burp my foods. I don't get that symptom. So if I can do one thing at a time, it really just helps me understand what foods work for me. And that's a difficult thing because that's very individual. But I think there are some overall framework ideas that help people understand how to start.
That's a great tip too. Just removing all variables and just keeping it simple. If you are having GI issues or eczema or some sort of health issue, that you can really kind of decipher yourself. And again, that's to your point, not everything works for everyone, and everyone is so individualized. And I think it's so interesting when, especially people on the internet, they're like, oh my gosh, you're demonizing this quote health food. Well, maybe it's just not working for you, and maybe it works for them, and that's fine. And I also love that when going back to sourdough or the tomato paste, for example, really making it yourself. And as opposed to buying it at the store, maybe it is the quote, the best sourdough you've ever heard of, but you don't know, or you don't know how old it is, or you don't know. So it is a good idea to make it yourself if you really are wanting to introduce something for the first time or in a long time.
You can understand the quality better. What kind of potatoes did somebody use to make that mashed potatoes?
Totally.
I just think, here in Costa Rica, to get really granular, I think, what kind of salt did they put in this? Is it just regular salt? Because, in Costa Rica, I just don't know what's in the salt. And is something in the salt, whether it's is it an iodized salt? Is there something in the salt that's bothering me? Or just the preparation, you can control all the little variables when you make it yourself. I think that's really valuable for people to understand.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's talk about fiber for a second, because a lot of my listeners, they do have GI issues. And at least for me, everyone's saying, oh my gosh, well, fiber is the best thing for your gut. And I typically I stick with a low fiber diet, and I am very regular every single day. And I feel like I don't need a lot of fiber. And the more fiber I eat, the more constipated I can get. And it can really upset my digestion. So I want to know, like, what's your take on fiber? Do you eat a lot of it? Do you focus on it?
Yeah, I think fiber is overrated for people. In my diet, I'm getting some fiber, but I don't push it. Most of the time, I'm just doing fruit juice. I mean, I'll juice mangoes, or I'll juice watermelon. Watermelon doesn't have a lot of fiber anyway, but I'll juice fruit, oranges. So it's pretty low fiber generally for me. Occasionally, when I experiment with things like white potatoes, or yesterday I experimented with sweet potatoes. I got organic potatoes. I peeled them myself. I cut them. I cooked them in a pressure cooker. So that's going to increase my fiber somewhat, but my diet is pretty low to medium fiber. And I think that a lot of people feel better when they eat less fiber. And it's very individual. The idea that there is this geometric relationship between fiber and health is just not something I see supported in the literature, in any interventional study at least, or in real life practice with humans. I think that I've heard a lot of people say that a little bit of fiber helps. And certainly when I was eating absolutely zero fiber on a carnivore diet, a lot of people will get diarrhea with that because bile salts are not reabsorbed. So having some small amount of plant fiber is pretty much inevitable if you're eating any fruit or fruit juice. There's always some fiber in there. But I think that for most people, more fiber is not the answer to your gut issues. There's something else going on for most people. And there are many, many people who really benefit by decreasing fiber.
Yeah. Well, do you eat any vegetables at all?
So let's just differentiate here. So fruit is sort of the sweet, colorful part of a plant that encases the seeds that plants kind of want you to eat, if you think about this. And vegetables technically are things like the leaves, the stems, the roots, and the seeds of plants. So I don't eat, and the seeds are seeds, nuts, grains, and beans. So I don't eat any seeds. I don't eat any nuts. I don't eat any grains. I don't eat any beans. We can talk about grains and why I don't eat those things. I don't eat any leafy greens. I don't eat any stems. But I have experimented with roots recently. White potatoes didn't feel great. Sweet potato, just started experimenting with it yesterday, so who knows? So technically, yesterday, yes, I ate a vegetable. It was a tuber, but I don't do any leafy greens. I don't do seeds. I don't do nuts. I don't do grains. I don't do beans. Stems would be things like, stems would be like celery or asparagus. I don't eat those things either.
What about medicinal herbs like rosemary and things like, is that in a different category, you would say then?
Yeah, the herbs are usually like the leaves, like whether it's oregano or rosemary, and they're such small amounts that I think most people are not sensitive to those. Some people could be. The spices are tricky for people because spices are ground up seeds. So depending on the sensitivity, I think spices can present a problem for people. If your gut is having issues, you might want to think about spicy foods, whether it's a paprika or a cayenne or a cumin. Well, cumin's not super spicy, but a lot of the cayennes or the spicy peppers can really irritate the gut. And that's a lot of times because of the seeds. Things like coriander, cumin, these are seed spices. So those, I think, the problem with seeds is that a lot of seeds are hard for humans to digest, and some people are sensitive to seeds. And it can extend even to things like black pepper, which people always kind of shake their head at when I mention. But I mean, black pepper is a seed. It's from a fruit around the seed, but your peppercorn is a seed. And there's a lot of compounds in black pepper that can interfere with digestion or even phase 2 detoxification in the liver and cause certain compounds to become hyperabsorbed in the human body that shouldn't be. This is the whole turmeric and black pepper thing, right? So turmeric is this root that humans have been eating for a very long time, which contains a compound called curcumin. If you look at curcumin carefully in the literature, it's not really that beneficial for humans. There's maybe a study or two showing that the curcumin might decrease osteoarthritis pain. So it might have some, quote, anti-inflammatory actions at the level of prostaglandins, but at what cost? And interestingly, if you just eat turmeric root without black pepper, the body gets rid of most of it. It's not very well absorbed, less than 1%. But if you eat it with black pepper, because black pepper inhibits the enzyme that detoxifies, quote unquote, or gets rid of the curcumin, you absorb like 2,000 times more curcumin. And then the question is that good? Should we be doing that or not? Because this is a normal process. If you just eat a turmeric root, your body is getting rid of curcumin. More than 99% gets out. So it's interesting to think about. This enzyme is called UDP, glucuronyl transferase. It puts a glucuronide moiety on the curcumin to try and get rid of it. So it's interesting how it all works and sort of like, do you want to do that? And then if you look at the literature, curcumin has been associated with decreased androgens, so male sex hormones, but not, they're also in females, in prostate cancer models, which is where these things are studied. So curcumin could be argued that it decreases testosterone, which is an important hormone for both men and women. There's all sorts of other potential negative effects to curcumin. Do we want to be amplifying that signal in the human body with something that inhibits the body's sort of natural, quote, normal tendency to detoxify it? It's just an interesting question. So herbs are like the leaves of plants, whether it's rosemary, oregano, whatever. Basil, they're such small amounts. Usually people are fine with it, but the seed spices, I would be a little more careful with, just depending on how you do overall. But I generally just use salt. I don't use black pepper. And to get really granular, I'm trying to find low or zero microplastic sea salts these days, but that's like really far down the rabbit hole.
Wow. I mean, yeah, well, speaking of plastics, let's talk about it because first of all, I have a question. So maybe where do you get your ground meat? Because so many people these days, maybe they're avoiding plastics, but they get their ground meat, and so much ground meat, or even just meat in general, is vacuum sealed in plastic. And like, how do you get away from that?
That's probably the part that's the hardest, And I think that it's not about being perfect. For me, it's just about being better. I think that when I look at sources of plastic exposure to humans, the meats and the ground meats, that's not our biggest exposure. The biggest exposure is plastic water bottles, probably, because they're in it for so much longer and they get heated and the plastics can become in the water. And then other things like salt or moderate cans. I think a big source of exposure that people don't know about is actually the dust in your home. If you have polyester carpets or polyester furniture, then there's good literature that like the dust in your home is aerosolized microplastics from these polyester plastic containing home goods that end up on your plates. And if you don't rinse the plate before you use it, there's dust on the plate, and that dust contains significant amounts of plastics in your food. I think most people are going to do great by just switching from plastic cookware, plastic storageware to glass, stainless steel water bottles, glass water bottles, not drinking out of plastic water bottles. You asked me earlier, do I eat anything out of a can? No, that's a big reason why, because all cans are lined with plastic. So if you do those things, you will significantly limit your exposure to plastics. You can get meat that's not in plastic, but it's really hard. You could literally go to a butcher and bring them a glass container and say, hey, can you grind the meat and put it in this? But I think that's a level that's like really not tenable for most people. You just have to know the farmer and say, hey, can you give me the meat in glass? And to be honest, I don't go that far either. I just sort of accept that, like, look, my meat is going to come in plastic, and that's just the one hit that I can't avoid that. It's just impossible for me to avoid it. Now, ground meat is probably worse than like a steak in plastic, but I just hope that it hasn't been in the plastic that long. Hopefully it's not gotten hot because it would spoil. Whereas you think about something like water in plastic could have been in there for 6 months.
Right. Well, and two, you could just go to the butcher, and they even wrap it in a plastic, it's a plastic lined paper, and people think, well, it's paper, but it's lined with plastic, just like the coffee cups.
And a lot of the plastic lining of those things contains these forever chemicals, the PFAs. So if you're savvy, I mean, a lot of the butchers today will have wax paper. And you can ask them, hey, if I'm going to get meat, will you wrap it in wax paper before you put it in the plasticized paper? I get it. I mean, they don't want the juice from your steak like leaking over your bananas in your grocery cart. That's not fun. But you just have to kind of plan for it. And I think there's just levels, and plastics are pervasive. I mean, we think about the clothes we wear, our underwear, everything in our homes. And so it just starts with like this gradual process of understanding, like, okay, they're not It's probably not possible to completely avoid them, but I think it's valuable. I mean, there was this recent study that came out. I don't know if you saw this, really interesting. They looked at the plaque in people's carotid arteries. So they did carotid artery biopsy. Which the carotid artery is this artery in your neck. And it's easy to access because you can just actually, cut in someone's neck and pull the plaque out of it. And they looked at the amount of microplastics in carotid artery plaque. And they found that the people who had the highest amounts of microplastics in the plaque were, I think, 3 to 4 times more likely to have heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular disease long-term. That's fascinating. The highest level of microplastics exposure, at least deposited in the carotid arteries, was a very, very high hazard ratio of cardiovascular disease in general. So whether these microplastics are actually damaging the inside of our arteries, the endothelium, which is a reasonable hypothesis, there's some apparent link between microplastic exposure and cardiovascular disease. So I do think it's worth minimizing our exposure to plastics. And the statistics are crazy. I mean, I've heard different things, but people say like, oh, you're eating 5 grams of microplastics a month, which is the equivalent of a credit card, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like literally mind blown. And plastics are everywhere and people just don't think about it. I mean, especially in heated stuff, which is what you really want to avoid. Now, gosh, I have literally a list of questions here. I'm like wondering what direction to go in, but you did mention grains earlier and why, like, what's the deal with grains? And just elaborate on that for a second.
Sure. Yeah. Grains are interesting. Grains are seeds. If you plant an oat in the ground, it grows into an oat plant. If you plant a wheat berry in the ground, it grows into a piece of wheatgrass. So a grain is a seed. It's this plant's baby. It's sort of how the plant moves its DNA to the next generation, and they're full of defense chemicals. If you look at humans throughout our evolution, we've been eating grains for 15, 20,000 years. But I mean, Weston Price did this work in the 1940s with his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. You look at indigenous cultures, they always detoxify the grains. Grains can be a source of nutrition and calories for humans, but they are probably the most tricky thing in the plant world because they're so highly defended. So I think humans can eat grains and be healthy, but that we would do well to ferment, sprout, soak the heck out of these things because they just contain so many defense chemicals. Whether the problem is phytic acid, which is very, very high in oats. It's this large molecule that chelates minerals and basically can pull minerals out of your body, whether it's calcium or magnesium or manganese or selenium, zinc. All of these things are critical minerals. And if you're eating oats that are not significantly fermented, there's a lot of phytic acid in oats and it's hard to get rid of it. You have to ferment the oats for a long amount of time. I did a whole podcast on this because I got so much pushback when I said that oatmeal was not a great thing. I didn't think that oatmeal was healthy because, let's face it, 99% of us eat oats that are not fermented, not soaked, not in any way prepared. They're just rolled oats cooked in a pan. Now, when you cook the oats, you might get rid of 20% or 30% of the phytic acid, but that still leaves 80, 70% of the phytic acid to kind of rob you of minerals. And to really get rid of, you can get up to 95% degradation of phytic acid, but that takes 4 to 5 days of fermentation at 78 degrees Fahrenheit in a pH of 4 to 5. So you have to make an acidic solution at a certain temperature to really detoxify the oats. And look, it's doable. And this is kind of the idea with sourdough. You're taking wheat and you're fermenting the heck out of it for days and days and days. Anyone that's ever made sourdough knows that it's really sour. And in a past life, I was a baker and we had a sourdough starter and we didn't use all sourdough, but you could make a sourdough from entirely fermented wheat. So if you're not sensitive to the gluten, and I think that's questionable how many people are, I think a lot of people are, but some people appear to be able to eat it just fine. Maybe heirloom varieties are better. You can put wheat in a container and ferment it and the bacteria from the air will do it. And again, it's just like oats. Like you can ferment the heck out of grains and make them less problematic for humans. But if you're not doing that, then you just have to understand that these grains come with a lot of liabilities. Oats also contain a compound called saponins, which is irritating for the human gut. The list goes on and on, right? Wheat contains gluten, which is problematic. Wheat contains other digestive enzyme inhibitors. Rice is the same way for a lot of people. Unless you ferment it, it's going to cause problems. Again, with rice, you take the hull off, which removes most of the heavy metals, but there still are some heavy metals. I mean, I saw you post about parboiling rice to decrease the arsenic in the rice. I mean, there are sort of liabilities with these grains. The other thing about grains to know is that all the seeds of plants tend to accumulate heavy metals. And heavy metals are tricky, right? Because most doctors don't test for them, although you can just do a blood test for lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. But most doctors don't test for heavy metals. And there's a lot of cadmium in oats. There's a lot of mercury. And well, actually, I think it's lead and cadmium in cacao, chocolate. Again, it's a seed. So we just have to know that like seeds accumulate heavy metals, and it's just tricky to get. That's why rice is a problem with arsenic. So if we're eating a lot of grains, you're exposing yourself to a lot of heavy metals. No one ever talks about this. And again, there are ways to potentially mitigate it. You can parboil your rice. So if you get white rice and it's organic and you parboil it, that gets rid of a lot of the arsenic. Just like you could ferment the oats for 4 days or at least do overnight oats and some sort of fermentation in your oats, which will decrease the phytic acid. It won't get rid of the heavy metals in oats, and the saponins are not degraded with fermentation. But I think the idea here is just for people to know that, like, look, grains are a big part of our diet as Americans and as Westerners. And if you're not thriving or your gut is having issues, cutting them out could be really healthy, even though they're considered a health food. I mean, I just was talking to a friend on the beach the other day, and she told me that she had anxiety and kind of OCD symptoms. And this is just her anecdote, but I think it's so valuable. And she said when she cut out leafy greens and oats from her diet, her anxiety and OCD got so much better. And for the first time in her adult life, she was able to not take her SSRI and did not have a recurrence of her OCD, her obsessive compulsive symptoms, which were kind of intrusive, recurrent thoughts. So that's interesting. I mean, it's just her anecdote, but I think these N of 1 anecdotes are something that should generate some hypotheses and make us curious. I mean, that was the only thing she did, right? So she really could accurately say, I just stopped leafy greens and oats, and I kept eating meat and eggs and fruit. And I think she was eating sweet potatoes. She kept eating those, and her psychiatric mental health symptoms got better. So what's going on there? That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is fascinating. And also, I feel like just grains in general are one of the top highly sprayed crops just for glyphosate. Also, I think I would say vegetables as well, but just grains and wheat, oats, those are just like heavily sprayed unless, I mean, even organic, I've seen tests, organic oats have come back positive for glyphosate. So it's like, okay, who do we trust here now?
You're right. There's a lot of pesticides on grains. Then you get into mold toxins. I mean, the list is so long on grains because grains are stored, right? Akin to water bottles in plastic, you can take oats and store them for months, or wheat. And that's just, a little bit of moisture and you get mold on oats. I mean, this is the idea of ergotism, ERGOTISM. And that's like St. Elmo's fire is this historical reference to people going a little crazy from ergot poisoning on rye historically. So I've heard people say, like, I knew a woman who said that she had a miscarriage and she thought it was related. She's pretty sure it was related to a rye sourdough that she was making that got ergot fungus on it and caused a miscarriage. So like, yeah, fermentation can help somewhat, but grains tend to be more moldy for people that are sensitive to that. And again, it's not saying they're bad for everyone, but it's just, they present a lot of problems for us. If you look at the mold toxins, whether it's like zearalenone or fumonisins or like the ochre toxins or aflatoxins, there's so many different mold toxins that can be a problem for humans, and grains are one of the biggest sources.
Yeah, well, and I also want to preface too that we're not fear mongering here, because I'm sure you get so many messages and hate people and like, oh my gosh, Paul, you're fear mongering. And I mean, I get them too. And it's like, hey, look, you're just trying to educate people and let them know, like, this is the truth. Like, I'm not fear mongering, right? You just want to expose the truth and maybe provide some options for better alternatives.
I think knowledge is power. Know better, do better. As I've evolved over the years, I've started being more sensitive to this idea and saying, hey, look, if you're thriving, don't change anything. But if you're not, here's a piece of information that might be useful for you. But I think that's the main pushback when I talk about oats, is he's fear mongering. And I think that, no, there are definitely people that benefit from removing oats or spinach or kale or wheat or rice from their diet. And if no one's talking about it, then no one's talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and then you did talk about fertility. So let's talk about some foods for pregnancy specifically. Like if a woman is trying to get pregnant, or maybe she already is, what are some really top foods that a woman should be incorporating?
Animal foods. And I think that within the animal kingdom, this may come as a surprise, but I think beef is probably the cleanest if you can find grass-fed beef. You asked me earlier about chicken and turkey. The problem with chicken and turkey is not that they're not, feasible or reasonable to eat, just that it's hard to find really pasture-raised chicken and turkey that get to like root and peck and eat bugs and worms. They're not always eating what they're supposed to eat. And grass-fed beef, especially from a good farm, that's a ruminant. Whether it's also, whether it's lamb, is kind of the same way. Like that's eating grass, and that's what it's supposed to eat. So that's really high quality food. And for whatever reason, I think this is one of the tragedies of our current generation. A lot of women are taught to fear red meat, that it's not feminine, or it's somehow masculine, or it's going to make you have more testosterone or make you infertile. I don't know what it is, but red meat is such an incredible food, whether that's beef or lamb or venison or buffalo. It's a great food for women. And then coupled with that is just even a little bit of organs goes a long way. And I've been eating a lot of heart recently. Heart is an amazing food. It's very high in riboflavin, and it has coenzyme Q10, more than muscle meat. So I make heart burgers. I'll just go to the butcher and ask them to grind heart, and I'll mix the heart in with the burger. You can also ask your butcher to grind liver in. A huge vitamin for women in preconception and pregnancy is folate, and egg yolks and liver are great sources of folate as well. So getting a little bit of liver, just a half an ounce of liver per day, can really be helpful for women and men also. But half an ounce is like less than a quarter size piece of liver. And whether you want to freeze it and cut it up and like chew it, or putting a little bit in a smoothie, you won't even taste it. If you've got a banana smoothie, hopefully it's not a green smoothie, but you do you guys do whatever you want to do. But if you do a smoothie and you put in a little bit of liver, you won't even taste it. There's also the desiccated organs. That's the reason I built Heart and Soil, which is the desiccated organ company that I have. I knew my mom and my sister wouldn't take fresh liver, and so you can get it in a capsule. It's freeze dried. Just getting a little bit of liver and heart and good quality red meat will go a long way, with some egg yolks. And I think that chicken and pork and turkey are great, but just realize that it's hard to find good quality. And I'll say the same thing about fish. Fish is a tricky one today. It's a very polluted food. And for whatever reason, I think a lot of women turn to fish thinking it's cleaner or healthier, because saturated fat in meat has been incorrectly vilified. It's been incorrectly demonized, but fish is really high in heavy metals, even salmon, but especially things like tuna or bigger fish, heavy metals, lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, PFAs, forever chemicals, microplastics. The list goes on and on. Fish is kind of a tough food today. It's not that I don't think humans could ever eat it. It's just that I think that so many people I have worked with or met who have done pescatarian diets end up with heavy metal toxicity and really high levels of heavy metals in their body, along with untestable things like forever chemicals and microplastics. And so making the majority of your protein sourced from fish is dangerous in 2024. And there are some companies, I recently learned about a company called Seatopia. I have no connection with them, that is doing kind of farmed fish, but they're doing it better. And I hope these things could become more sustainable and more available. Like they're actually testing for all those things. So if you can get a really good quality fish, it could be a great source of nutrition for humans, but they're just more polluted, even from things like Costa Rica, right? Obviously, if you live in San Diego or Los Angeles and you catch fish off the coast there, you think, oh, this fish is polluted, it lives here. But the ocean is continuous, and even fish in Costa Rica, I would be hesitant to eat, because they're pretty much all going to have these issues.
Wow. I mean, those are really some good tips for pregnancy, first of all, and then great tips regarding the liver and tossing it in your smoothie. I actually saw this one girl, she was doing that. And she's like, look, I just toss a little bit in my smoothie, don't even taste it. Then also, like, I feel like we also need to be aware that we can actually overdo it on the liver, because couldn't you get like, quote, liver toxicity if you eat too much?
I think that the number of people with vitamin A insufficiency is way, way higher than people with vitamin A toxicity. And I think that we don't fully understand differences between vitamin A toxicity related to supplements versus natural forms of vitamin A. But I think that the better part of valor, don't eat 8 ounces of liver every day, because we know. So like there's this famous tale of polar bear liver, right? And the Arctic explorers got sick from polar bear liver. Polar bear liver has 1,000 times more vitamin A than cow liver. So 1 ounce of polar bear liver is equivalent to 1,000 ounces. I think maybe it's 100. I think it might be 100x. So 1 ounce of polar bear liver is 100 ounces of regular liver. Now, 16 ounces in a pound. That 1 ounce of polar bear liver, which is where a lot of the vitamin A fearing comes from, would be equivalent to pounds and pounds and pounds of regular cow's liver. Liver of carnivores. So if you're eating a lion's liver, for instance, that could have a lot of vitamin A in it, and you might want to be careful with that. But I think the threshold in pregnancy, not differentiating between supplemental versus natural forms of vitamin A, I believe is 10,000 IUs. You could even cut that in half and say 5,000 IUs of vitamin A, but you're going to get less than 5,000 IUs of vitamin A in half an ounce of liver. Like an ounce of liver, I think you can fact check me on this. I think an ounce of liver, off the top of my head, is around 5,000 IUs of vitamin A, and that's retinol vitamin A. So like the retinol form, which is the most bioavailable form. So half an ounce of liver is well within the safe zone. And you don't even have to do half an ounce a day. You could do half an ounce 3 or 4 times a week, or an ounce twice a week of liver. 1 ounce twice a week, you're going to be fine.
Well, my question is, who's eating polar bear liver?
No one. But that's where a lot of the vitamin A fear comes from, right? You'd have to eat a lot of cow's liver to get that much vitamin A. A lot. I think that, but every once in a while I hear someone, I'll be at a conference or a gathering and somebody says, man, I ate like a pound of liver all at once. And I thought, okay, that's great. Just, you don't need to eat liver for the next month. You're fine.
Yeah. You can definitely overdo it on anything. Like you said, like you can drink too much water. Like it's
sure. And just remember that, vitamin A is fat soluble, just like vitamin D. I think probably best to get vitamin D from the sun without getting burned, depending on your, the tone of your skin and how you feel about that. But if you wanted to get vitamin D from a supplement, you could probably overdose on a vitamin D supplement. In fact, I'm sure you could. So any fat soluble vitamin you could get too much of. And it's just, don't go crazy with the liver, but small amounts.
Right. Now, okay. So we just talked about like some foods for pregnancy. Now I want to talk about men's fertility for a second, because I heard this study. So I want to talk about saunas. Yeah. So there was a study that came out. It's been known to reduce the sperm count and motility in men, for men that do saunas. Now, also, I want to say that it was like after 5 weeks, the sperm motility did kind of come back, but it said it took 5 weeks for it to come back. Have you heard of this study before?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, not to be too graphic, but a man's testicles move, right? So like they raise and they lower depending on our body temperature. The testicles are this is just how we're designed as men. Ovaries are always in a woman's body. They're always kind of the body temperature, but testicles are very tightly regulated in terms of temperature, so that the sperm can be held, a little bit below body temperature. So when a man is hot, the testicles are gonna be further away from the body. When he's cold, the testicles are gonna be closer to the body. So what happens in a sauna is you're kind of just sitting there and you're in an oven at 180 degrees or 210 degrees for a long amount of time. And the testicles are just going to get too hot. The same thing could happen in a hot tub. If you sit yourself in a hot river or a natural spring or a hot tub, you're going to affect sperm motility negatively, because you're going to make the sperm too hot. And this is important for men to know if they're in a relationship and they're trying to conceive. Like you probably don't want to be going in saunas and sitting in hot tubs.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting tip. And so just something for people to be aware of, like everyone's doing saunas now. So.
And, the same could be said for the choice of men's underwear. I don't think many men are using, like really tight briefs anymore that just hold everything up in there. But if you were using like a really tight brief, you might consider like just using something a little looser to allow the testicles to do what they've just done historically.
Yeah, well, let's talk about underwear for a second, because that was actually one of my questions. Because I've seen a reel that you did, it was a while ago, about the whole Lululemon situation, and just, I mean, people are, women and men, they're wearing things very close to their reproductive organs, and that could be hindering a lot of things.
I don't think we fully know how much it's hindering it, but it's a concern. And so the Lululemon in some of their leggings and Old Navy and a number of companies, it wasn't just Lululemon, but that was the one that went viral. They do put these PFAs. So they do put these forever chemicals in the leggings, and especially in the crotch region, because that's a region with sweat and moisture, and they're trying to keep it dry. I mean, this is the same kind of chemicals you'd find in like Gore-Tex garments and stuff, right? If you want to keep the garment dry, you can use these fluorine containing chemicals to keep them dry. And the problem is that, women have a lot of mucosal tissue in the crotch region that's absorbent, and a lot of women don't wear the leggings with underwear that could prevent the absorption. It's just an interesting question, like how much the PFAs do appear to be absorbed transdermally. There's good evidence for that. So could women be getting transdermal absorption of PSAs, these forever chemicals, through leggings? It's possible. And it's like, okay, that's just something to know about. Like, we're just exposed to a lot of things. We talked about microplastics,
Yeah.
It's tough. It's tough being a human in 2024. Again, if you're thriving, don't change anything. I've talked to a lot of women and they're like, I'm still going to do it. And I was like, that's your decision. At least, they're like, it just looks cuter this way. And I was like, I get it. They look great. But I think that, the solution would be either find leggings that don't have that, or, that say they don't use PFAs, or, wear like a barrier type of underwear or a thong or whatever a woman wants to do.
Do you have any brands, like any recommendations that you would recommend? Like,
I don't know much about women's underwear, not surprisingly.
I mean, okay, not even I'm sorry, I should have been more specific. Like in general, there's typically companies, they offer non-toxic underwear, shirts, just clothing in general.
Yeah. I don't know, because I don't look at that stuff. I just don't look at leggings that much. I mean, I've seen them and then I don't think about it because it's just not what I do. But I think if you look at that stuff, there are companies doing it, whether it's wool or cotton or bamboo. There's definitely non-toxic, quote, natural everything out there now, whether it's leggings or, shorts, all this kind of stuff. It's definitely there.
Okay. Now I have some follower questions, if you're cool with just answering. There, no particular order.
Yeah.
That I submitted a few days ago. I was like, hey, I'm going to be interviewing Paul. So people did submit some questions, and this was an interesting one. So how to heal, I guess, in your body, if you're allergic to animal proteins. And this really caught my eye, because I was like, is there an actual definition of someone allergic to animal protein? And there was.
So there's a tick, right, in the United States, the Lone Star tick, and that can cause anaphylaxis, so a pretty serious reaction to red meat and all those kind of things. I don't know if this person has that, that's called alpha-gal syndrome. It's alpha-GAL syndrome. And in that case, people can do chicken or turkey, like white meat, but they can't do red meat, and they could do fish. And alpha-gal, I've heard of acupuncture maybe helping with desensitization. And then there are some desensitization protocols for alpha-gal. If somebody really has an allergy to animal protein, I'd be curious. It's very rare to have an actual IgE reaction to all animal protein, which is the same thing. This is the equivalent of alpha-gal for every animal protein. That's an anaphylactic reaction, which is where the throat swells up, you get hives. This is really, really, really rare. Sometimes what I've encountered is that people don't digest meat well, and they think of it as an allergy. They're just not digesting it well. And in this case, I think that the problem is possibly nutrient deficiency, specifically zinc. Zinc is necessary to make stomach acid. And a lot of people, whether they're women especially or men, if they're coming from vegan or vegetarian diets, can develop zinc deficiencies because there's not a lot of zinc-rich foods in the plant food kingdom. And the foods that do have zinc, like pumpkin seeds, I remember when I was a vegan, they said, eat pumpkin seeds for zinc. It was the one food that had zinc. It's not very bioavailable because they're full of phytic acid, the compound we talked about earlier that kind of chelates minerals. So I think that zinc deficiency is much more common than people understand. And if you're having trouble digesting meat, consider a zinc deficiency. And then you could consider supplementing with zinc or introducing small amounts of meat to get sort of, the nutrients gradually. So I would suggest small amounts of meat. See what you're sensitive to. I definitely have heard of people who have trouble digesting red meat over chicken and turkey, which is okay. Start with chicken and turkey and then introduce red meat very slowly. If you just cannot eat red meat, it's not the end of the world. You can find really good chicken and turkey out there, and that's equally nutritious, I would argue. I mean, it's really good. And you can get chicken and turkey organs if you want from a butcher, or some people can do liver, but they can't do muscle meat from the cow. So it just depends. Some people can eat buffalo, but they can't eat cow. Some people can eat lamb, but they can't eat cow. Some people can eat venison. And so I think you just have to try and zero in on what it is. It's very different between people. And if you really are sensitive, just do small amounts to start.
Wow, those are great.
Make sure you don't have alpha-gal. Yeah, I mean, it could be a tick, but people would probably know about that. That's
wow. Yeah, that's
common.
insane.
Yeah.
I feel like you almost answered my next two questions from followers, which is, one of them is, what is the best way to start eating meat after 10 years of being vegan? I'm afraid my stomach won't be able to digest it.
Go slow.
Okay. Would you do like bone broth? Would that be?
Yeah, you could do bone broth. Go slow. And what do I mean? Like, again, a quarter size piece of meat.
Like a meatball or something. Like
less than a meatball,
okay.
Half a meatball. And maybe consider a zinc supplement. I would not do long-term unopposed zinc supplementation because zinc without copper can lead to copper deficiency. So I don't think people should be taking pure zinc for long amounts of time. This is just the way these things work in nature, right? Liver is a good source of zinc. Muscle meat is a good source of copper. There is copper in our foods. It's supposed to kind of balance the zinc. So we need to have sources of copper in our diet. And I would not take zinc long-term unopposed. It can lead to copper deficiency, but it's rare. But some people may benefit from zinc supplementation if they're coming out of vegan or vegetarian diets. I mean, really like full organ complex, and again, here's another use case for like heart and soil for like a desiccated organ. We see this all the time at Heart and Soil. People will just start with the organ complex. It's literally, 6 capsules or 3 capsules of organ powder that they're going to add to a smoothie. So much nutrition in there, and most people can tolerate that. And then step up to the fresh organ or the steak or the ground beef as you're able to do more of it.
Yeah, those are some great tips. And I feel like you just answered like the next one too, just about like someone says that they reject meat every time they eat it. So you kind of gave some tips there with the zinc supplementation. Now, someone asked, I got hyperacidity from eating too much meat and now I have SIBO. Any suggestions? I have heard of that your body becomes too acidic from too much meat.
Well, it's interesting. This whole acid alkaline thing is a little bit of a conversation, but I'll just try and go high level. The pH of your blood doesn't change when you eat alkaline or acidic foods. And meat has more sulfur containing amino acids. So technically it is acidic, but you can balance it with any amount of fruit or plant foods, which have alkaline minerals like potassium or magnesium. So that should balance out. But I've not heard of SIBO from eating too much meat. I suppose it's possible on like a carnivore diet, but it sounds rare. So I don't know if they mean their stomach is too acidic or their small intestine is too acidic, but I think with SIBO, you have to think about a couple of things. I think of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I think of an autoimmune condition also. So there's this nervous system in the gut called the myenteric plexus that innervates the small intestine and creates these migrating motor complexes that sweep food down. And when people have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, it's a dysbiosis, and there's often motility issues connected with that because something about the myenteric plexus and the migrating motor complex are not working. So again, we're kind of back to this autoimmune crux, which is fascinating to me. And you think like, what other foods might you be eating that could be causing issues there? Anecdotally, I've heard about some people benefiting from supplementing with thiamine with SIBO. I haven't worked with anyone who's done that, but that's a possibility. Maybe it's a thiamine deficiency again. But it's a tricky thing. And it's a very individual case. So I think that if you're worried about acid alkaline balance from eating meat, you can easily balance that by eating fruit or any plant food will be fine. And the way you see that is just with a urinary pH. You're not going to see that in a blood pH because the blood pH is held very stringently tight by the human body. That's physiology. It has to be within a certain range for us to function, but you'll see it in your urinary pH. So if you're worried about being too acidic, quote unquote, just get a urinalysis. Every basic urinalysis, like the kind that you do if you thought you had a UTI, will tell you what your urinary pH is, and you can tell. When I was strict carnivore, the urinary pH was 5 or less. So that's very acidic. And now that I eat fruit, it's almost always 8 or above. So it's completely on the alkaline side now, at least in terms of the urinary pH. And I don't believe that alkalinity is the answer, that we should be using alkaline water filters or anything like this. I think you can become too alkaline as well, but you'll just see differences in your urinary pH depending on the mix of foods that you're eating. But SIBO is a tricky one. Think about foods that you could be eating that are causing an autoimmune condition at the level of the nervous system innervating the gut, and think about what things could be causing a dysbiosis. Maybe consider thiamine as a secondary thing. And yeah, but SIBO is a tricky one for people.
Yeah, for sure. It's a hard one to really nip in the bud there. Now, what someone asked, how do you deal with all the haters? Because I'm sure you get so much hate.
Yeah. It's been a journey over the last few years, right? I think that the more, Tim Ferriss said once that 10% of people are going to hate everything you do. Oh, that was great. So the bigger you get, the louder the hate voices go. And, whenever I do a piece of content that gets shared widely is when I get the most hate. And I think, well, 10% of people are going to hate everything I do. And I think that it just takes time. Another good piece of advice I received was you just have to know whose opinions matter to you, because you can't listen to everyone's opinion. But if you can find 3 or 4 or 5 people that you really respect and get their opinion, not everything. I'm honestly not stoked of everything I've ever done. Like I said, I've changed my mind on things. And so it's okay to get negative feedback. And I think that for me, the biggest piece is just realizing I'm never going to please everyone. Being in the real world, quote unquote, like being in person with people, whether it's at a conference or a gathering or meeting people at Erewhon, I'm reminded that so much of what people are saying to me is positive. I've never had a single negative thing in person. I've never had a negative encounter in person. Nobody ever said, what you said really hurt me. And it might be a confirmation bias, but I'm reminded that most of what we do, if we do it with good intention, is positive in the world. And people who don't want what we're offering can discard it. And, if people are not benefiting, they can make a shift and move on. It's the hate gets amplified online because we're just a species that is tuned to anyone in the tribe saying bad things. But we have to realize that like hundreds or thousands of voices, it's not evolutionarily consistent. You never would have had a tribe that big. So there never would have been this many people shouting negative things at you and people you didn't even know. And it's just a dystopian type of reality. So I think for me, remembering like people are always going to disagree with what I do. That's okay. And when I'm in real world, it seems like what I'm doing is beneficial to people, which encourages me. And then I think also realizing just having those key people to kind of look back on or kind of lean on and say, what do you think about this? How am I doing? That you really respect gives you sort of this foundation to base what you're doing on. Because sometimes you are going to need course correction, and just knowing that not everyone's opinions matter.
Yeah. And people online, they're so quick to judge versus people in person, and those keyboard warriors or trolls or whatever you want to call them, they're just going to say whatever because they have no repercussions. But I mean, you have helped so many lives, Paul. It's just amazing.
So, yeah. The other thing I heard, I just thought of this, is that no one who is doing more than you will ever criticize you. And I think that's great. Like, people that are working harder than you, they're not going to criticize you. It's just people doing less. And there's got to be a modicum of jealousy there. So people doing less than you are really the people who are criticizing you. I think about that's so true. Like, I don't often get criticism from people who are doing more than me.
Oh, that's a really good point too. I mean, I get so much hate online too, and it's just you just have to really put yourself back into perspective here, and really just move on with your life, because you can't let that upset your day or your life. Now, do you have any tips?
Yeah.
No. Okay, so I do have one more question.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for those wanting to try an animal-based diet on a budget?
Yeah, I've done a couple of pieces of content about this. I think that you can go to Target, you can go to Walmart, you can go to Safeway, you can go to any grocery store and get grass-fed beef for I would say $5 to $7 a pound. And if that's too expensive, you can get conventional beef for $3 to $4 a pound. So, and I think that like perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of good. If you can't afford grass-fed beef, get conventional beef. If you can't afford organic produce, get conventional produce. Like the fact that you're eating unprocessed plant and animal food is far better than eating ultra-processed junk food. And of course, the goal is, can I get organic fruits and vegetables for my family? Can I get grass-fed beef? Yes. Ground beef is the biggest hack. It's like I said, you can usually get grass-fed ground beef for $7 a pound. A steak could be $35 a pound. So there's a massive multiplier there and a difference. You don't have to eat steaks. You don't have to get the most expensive produce. A lot of times you can find organic foods at a Walmart or a Target and it's cheaper. Sometimes the organic food is the same price as a Whole Foods or a Lazy Acres or something else. But, Sprouts is pretty darn affordable for their organic food, and even conventional is going to be very affordable. And somebody told me this recently. I don't know if it's true, that like Sprouts stock is up 30%. Fact check me. I don't know. And I thought, man, they're doing good. I mean, I do a lot of content at Sprouts. I need to talk to them and kind of get some sort of affiliate deal or something.
Yeah, no.
I don't have any affiliations with Sprouts, but between all the raw milk that I talk about at Sprouts, but I mean, Sprouts is great. Like it's really a no nonsense. Again, no affiliation with Sprouts. No, I have no financial interest in Sprouts. They're so no nonsense. It's just a basic grocery store that has higher quality food than you'd expect.
Well, and I saw the reel that you shared, and 2 days ago, I went to Sprouts and bought frozen liver, grass-fed liver, and you had a reel about it and it went viral.
Yeah. They have all sorts of grass-fed meat at Sprouts. They have often, if you're in a state where raw milk is legal, they sell raw milk. If you're in a state where raw milk is not legal in a grocery store, the Sprouts has a raw pet kefir, which is the same as the human kefir from that company. They can't say it, but I know it to be true. And I did a reel about that. And the FDA sent a letter to the company that makes that raw milk and said, on September 23rd, 2023, Paul Saladino drank your pet kefir. And I mean, they didn't get in trouble, but it's just they're watching the raw milk very closely.
Wow.
So you can.
That? I mean, I have a question. Like, why is the government really pounding down on raw milk? Because it's so good for you.
Good question. I think that historically, the historical precedent is that people have gotten sick from raw milk from variable quality producers. So there's a historical precedent there, but people have also gotten sick from sushi, from raw vegetables, from spinach. A lot more people eat raw vegetables than they do raw milk. But if you look, the highest number of food poisoning every year is always raw leafy greens. Cantaloupe is another big one. I guess there's something on the outside of cantaloupe that you cut into it. Any raw food, whether it's a fruit or a vegetable or a meat or a piece of fish, sushi, or anything, can get you sick. And certainly raw liver can get people sick. You want to know the producer. You want to freeze it. You want to be careful with any raw food. And raw milk is no different. So you want to know the producer and you want to be careful. And you maybe don't want to give your frail 90-year-old grandmother who's immunocompromised raw sushi, raw meat, or raw milk, or raw vegetables. You probably want to cook their food and not give them a salad because they could get food poisoning for any of those things. But for most people, it's fine. And if you know the producer, raw milk can be really good. And I think historically, we would get raw milk from a local farmer and they would be careful and the cows would be healthy and they would wash the udders. And it would be fine. And it's just, occasionally raw milk gets contaminated and it gets a bad rap. And the outbreaks are very, very rare now because the government is on that like crazy now. So I don't know when. I'm sure that some places have gotten shut down for raw milk in the last couple of years, but it's very rare. And this farm, Raw Farm, again, no affiliation in California, they triple check their stuff. They do these crazy standards and stringency. They test every batch before it goes out. I've been to the farm and I've milked the cows, and the cow is getting milked. They wash the udders twice. They're very intentional about how cleanly they're doing this. They built a barn that has double washing of the cows as they come in to get milked. And then the milk goes from the cow's udder. And I think in under a minute, it's 37 or 34 degrees in their refrigerator. So it's kept cold immediately. They're so good at it now. And that's just, but that they're really setting the standard, and props to them for being that intentional about how they make raw milk. So they're showing that like raw milk can be done well. It's just a tricky thing, right? It's not an easy thing.
It's insane. Yeah. It's really insane. Like how much like negativity, I guess, the government or whoever you want to say is just, yeah, go ahead.
Right. And the flip side is just, because I've seen articles about this, and there recently was a hit piece, I don't know if it was in the Guardian or Daily Mail. One of these British papers came out and was kind of bagging on raw milk. And the dietitian or nutritionist that's written it invariably will say, raw milk isn't more healthy. And I think, well, there's a lot of studies that suggest that raw milk is a different food for humans. The Gabriella study, multiple other studies of children that grow up on or off farms drinking raw versus pasteurized dairy. And you see the kids that grow up drinking raw dairy have lower rates of asthma, eczema, and allergies. So it's probably something about the undenatured proteins in the milk that affect our immune system, and that probably affects us, interestingly, across species. So mammalian milk is probably beneficial for humans across species when it's raw. When you pasteurize it, some people become sensitive to that or sensitized to it. So do I have eczema and asthma and allergies because I drank pasteurized milk as a kid? Who knows? But would I have been better off drinking raw milk? There's multiple studies to suggest that could be the case. And I think that it's an individual decision that every parent unit has to make regarding, are you going to give your kids raw milk? Are you going to drink raw milk? Obviously, there's risks and benefits to everything, but there are benefits to raw milk over pasteurized milk, undoubtedly. And there is a significant, substantial amount of food poisoning that is quite severe of pasteurized milk as well. That is never really talked about, because when you have raw milk, you have thousands of organisms that occur naturally on the skin of the cow, on the udder. Raw milk from a mother to a baby in the humans that's raw. Like breast milk is raw, guys. Like it's not pasteurized. And, it's a mother keeping her skin clean. She's showering, whatever. Your baby is drinking raw human milk. And there's a significant amount of flora that is passed between the mother and the baby with breastfeeding. And that comes in the milk and from the skin. And the same thing happens on cow's milk. And a lot of those bacteria can be interesting and helpful for humans. They're commensal, and we benefit from them. And they probably are organisms that we've been coexisting with in a symbiotic way for thousands of years as humans in pastoralist cultures. And when you get rid of all those organisms, raw milk becomes, when you get rid of those organisms, the milk is pasteurized. Raw milk becomes pasteurized milk, and it's essentially a petri dish. Any little organism that ends up in pasteurized milk can just explode because there's no other organisms to prevent its growth. The idea of sterility is kind of a farce for us as humans. We know that we can never wash our hands enough to get all the bacteria off of our skin. That's crazy. You can never do that. If you wash your hands, you could get all the bacteria off, and then the bacteria from your skin on your forearm will just move onto your hands and coat your hands again with bacteria. And so the same thing happens in our mouths. There's all these literature coming out now. People have been talking about mouthwash. You don't want to sterilize your mouth. If you have bad breath, it's because you have dysbiosis, not because you have the wrong type of bacteria in your mouth, and you should just bomb your mouth with alcohol or other things that are trying to sterilize your mouth. We don't exist as sterile organisms, but this is kind of the terrain theory versus the microbe theory. Like the idea is to have a good microbiome to coexist with, whether in your gut or in your mouth or on your skin or, everywhere in our bodies contiguously, that helps push out the bad bacteria. That's really the issue here, which is why I think people should always be skeptical when the recommendation is you can bomb that one little bacteria out of there, because it usually comes back, or candida or any other overgrowth. It's usually because there's the wrong balance of organisms, whether it's a urinary tract infection or women getting yeast infections or bacterial vaginosis or any of these things. It's not because there's a bad yeast at any of those places or the wrong type of bacteria. It's because the balance is off, and the good bacteria can't outcompete the bad ones, or the good bacteria can't outcompete the eukaryotic yeast. And so there's a lot here that is just the theory of how we think about these things. And it goes back to just milk and who we are as humans. But the idea that that if there's a bad bacteria somewhere, even acne is the same thing. When I was in medical school, acne was blamed on a bacteria called Propionibacteria acne, Propionibacteria acnes. And you think, the answer to acne then is just washing your face. You're just not washing your face enough. That's not the case at all. It's probably related to some underlying condition in the human being, whether it's an autoimmune condition. I think that there's interesting theories around dietary responses to acne and dietary provocations of acne. I would argue seed oils are a huge contributing factor there. It's a whole separate conversation. But this is the rise of multi-billion-dollar companies with benzoyl peroxide rinses for the face. People are just trying to sterilize the heck out of their face without looking at the quality of their diet and their overall just microbiome everywhere on your skin and your gut. And it's just all continuous. So the idea that we can annihilate bacteria anywhere is just not the right idea. And pasteurized milk is kind of scary.
Wow. I mean, that's such a great explanation of pasteurized and raw and the whole bacteria thing. And I had no idea regarding the contamination of pasteurized milk, and that
Very
no one
common.
is talking about it. And I'm sure for good reason.
There was I think it was 1986. You can check me on the year. There was a huge outbreak of salmonella in pasteurized milk.
Man.
I'm just pulling the numbers off the top of my head. I think it was 200,000 people got sick. I think we could check. Again, fact check this, but and many people died. 200,000 plus people. I think 1986 salmonella outbreak pasteurized. People never talk about that. Again,
No.
whatever, 30 years ago, sure, but this stuff happens.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's insane. I feel like we're definitely over time here, but we're gonna have to have you back because I literally have so many other questions. I want to have you talk about seed oils and so many things. But last question before we close: what's next for Paul Saladino?
So, working on a documentary right now, and it's just about the quality of food being the biggest arbiter in our health and disease. I think there's a lot of documentaries that have been made for Netflix and other platforms that are anti-meat. So I really wanted to make a documentary that was pro-meat, that's just said meat can be a part of a healthy human diet. And it's not an animal-based documentary per se, but it is a documentary in which I talk about regenerative agriculture and the quality of foods and illness in humans, and probably talk about seed oils in there. And we've got people in the documentary doing an animal-based diet and following them for a month. And so, yeah, I mean, we're probably 4 or 5 months into filming the documentary. It's going to take another 5 to 6 to film it and then edit it. But probably in 2025, I'll release a documentary, which will be cool, like a full feature-length documentary. I'm writing a new book, which is again in the early stages, probably a 2025 release for a book. And the book is kind of a pushback against mainstream longevity ideas today. The idea that you can live longer by eating less animal protein and less calories. So caloric restriction and fasting. It's just this idea of less that I'm kind of pushing back against. And I think that if you look at the literature, it doesn't always support that that's the way to longevity for humans. It's a multifactorial question. And it's kind of a question that a little bit older audience begins to ask about longevity. It's very in vogue today, but I just look at the current longevity paradigm and I don't think it's totally right. So yeah, writing a book, doing a documentary, and trying to just keep making content that is like accessible, but also interesting and provocative for people.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for this documentary and your new book. So keep us posted on that. Of course, I will be sure to put all the links to where people can find you on social media in today's show notes in case they want to start following you. I'm assuming they are, but if they're not, definitely give Paul a follow and check him out. His content is great. His messages are great. And you're always welcome back here.
Thanks. And the other thing I mentioned Heart and Soil. I just built a food company called Lineage. So I want to make good quality animal-based food more available for people. Lineageprovisions.com. We made beef sticks with grass-fed beef and a little bit of liver and heart. And we've got all kinds of cool stuff coming out. So in May, we're going to release a protein powder. And everything that we're doing is kind of like, we're just trying to do it the highest quality that we can. So I just wanted to make more animal-based foods and snacks and things available for people because I know that we didn't talk much about convenience, but that's a real issue for people. So I'm really proud. It's a really cool place to be and where I can build businesses that help people lead lives that are easier and better. And I feel really good about that too.
Wow, Lineage. So literally grass-fed beef sticks with organ meats.
Yeah. I've got some right here.
Oh my goodness, this is so cool. I've never come across a meat stick with the organs.
Yeah. So these are out now. Lineageprovisions.com. That's what they look like. They're air dried.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an air dried meat stick. So it never gets heated above 78 degrees. I'm really proud of this because it's really hard to put liver and heart into a meat stick. And it's most of the meat sticks that you get in the grocery store, in fact, all of them are cooked. So it means they're heated to like 200 degrees or 180 degrees, which means they have to put celery powder or nitrates, lactic acid in there as preservatives. But we don't use any of that because these are air dried at 78 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 days. And only ingredients are meat, liver, heart, salt, vinegar, and a collagen casing. So it's really cool. I'm really proud of it.
Awesome.
It's hard to do, but yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, well, people should definitely check that out. We'll put all those links in today's show notes. And again, Paul, we're going to have you back because I feel like we can talk for like 5 more hours.
Yeah. It's super fun. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Digest This. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app to let us know. If you're ever wondering how you can support me and this podcast, sharing it with your friends and family is the best way. This is a Resonant Media production produced by Drake Peterson and edited by Mike Fry. To email the show, message us at digestthispod@gmail.com. See you next time. The content of this show is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for individual medical and mental health advice and does not constitute a provider-patient relationship. As always, talk to your doctor or health team first.